This is the Bureau of Lost Culture. I'm Stephen.
What does magic mean to you?
You're the sum total of my life so far. We've always believed that the real job of any artist is to take that decision to risk everything. Can we reveal enough about what we think being alive is, that humane beings can suddenly stop being so self-destructive and finally just wake up to the fact everything will be fantastic if we just don't have fear.
It's always a very thin line between jail and creativity.
The body is a cheap suitcase. The earth is a recording device. Everything will be fantastic if you decide not to be afraid. Neil Andrew Megson was born in Manchester on the 22nd of January 1950. He became a performance artist, a neo-pagan, an industrial music legend, an arch-provocateur. He was described variously as transgressive and blasphemous, accused of being a Satanist and sexually abusing children, which was a lie. In fact, he was a loving father and grandfather. The co-founder of COUM, Throbbing, Gristle, Psychic TV, better known in the world as Genesis P-Orridge, who later became infamous with their attempt to unite as a pandrogyne or single entity with their partner Lady Jaye through the use of extreme surgical body modification. I sat down with David Charles Rodriguez, director of She Is Still Here, a film about Genesis based around interviews carried out in the final months of their life. You may notice that we both use he, she and they at times to describe Genesis. It's quite confusing as he, she, they themselves used all those at different times, and as they repeatedly said, we are all many people. Here we go. David Charles Rodriguez. Hello, David.
Hey, how's it going?
Thanks for joining us on the Bureau of Lost Culture.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure to be here.
And congratulations on this film. It's amazing.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate it.
So you made this in the last year of Genesis's deeply countercultural life. And the film itself, what would you call it? A cosmic retrospective of the life and times of Genesis P-Orridge?
That sounds pretty good.
Before we do that, why don't we just hear a little bit about you? You are a filmmaker of some note, some time, and actually quite a wide range of projects.
You know, I like to say that I don't make films about people, I make them with people. The first film that really hit was the film Gay Chorus Deep South, about the San Francisco gay men's chorus doing an anti-Trump tour in the South. It won Tribeca in 2019. And it's now in the permanent collection of the Academy Museum. But more importantly, it's a film that tackles on the divisiveness of America through the power of music. And then I went on, partly because I'm Brazilian and also a big sports fan, I ended up doing a series for Netflix about Neymar, the Brazilian soccer player, when he was at Paris Saint-Germain. And strangely enough, I caught him in the low point of his career, which ended up becoming a blessing because it turned into a really transformative experience.
Two very different stories, and of course this story is wildly different than both of them, and actually this story is wildly different than nearly every other story, isn't it?
I was fortunate enough to, interview Jen and spend, a good portion of the last year of their life, which was incredibly meaningful and heavy but magical at the same time.
The interviews with Jen that you made were in the last year of his life. He died in 2020, right? How did you know about him, and what brought you to think, I've got to make a film about this person? And also, how did you do it? How did you get in contact?
I liked Jen's music when I was growing up. I grew up in Brazil and I was in the industrial goth scene. So inherently, you listen to Throbbing, Gristle and Psychic TV. They were never like my favorite bands. It was only later when I discovered Jen's art and the Pandrogyne project, and Jen and his partner, Lady Jaye, transitioned to look exactly alike. I was really into that idea of using extremism to talk about really soft and tender messages. So I started collecting some of Jen's art, and the New York Times wrote this bittersweet article talking about Jen having been diagnosed with terminal leukemia. Jen, months before I met her, came and visited me in a dream. It was really intense, and she came to my home, and I, wanted to show her the art that I had of hers. And all of a sudden, she just put her hands on my hands and she said, "Don't worry, darling, I'm transferring you all of my knowledge to you right now." And we stood there, with our hands on top of each other for, like, in the dream, it felt like hours. I never have dreams like this. This was literally the only dream of this sort that I've ever had. I had just finished a film, and I promised myself that I wouldn't jump into the next one. So I was like, this doesn't mean you have to make a film about Genesis. Just embrace the fact that you had a great dream and move on. And then Jen kept showing up in my life in many other ways in the next couple months, until finally we have a friend in common that connected us. And then I went to New York to meet with Jen for an hour, and it ended up becoming a 12-hour meeting. And towards the end of the 12-hour meeting, I felt comfortable enough to tell Jen about the dream. And then Jen takes out this book that she had just published of her conversations with Brian Geisen. And to be totally honest, I didn't know very much about Brian Geisen at the time. Brian has this quote that says, "Wisdom can only be passed through the touching of hands." And then we both just look at each other, and right there we made a spiritual agreement to make this film.
One of the things about that which strikes me immediately, there is something kind of magical in it. There's something magical in the dream and in the meeting. And what's interesting in your film, is that it starts off with this question. What does magic mean to you, you say?
When Jen was maybe a little bit younger than me, she did this series where she would meet with William Burroughs and then Brian Geisen and do these, kind of cosmic interviews with them. And Jen's first question ever to William Burroughs and then to Brian Geisen was, "What does magic mean to you?" So I thought it was kismet or special to do that. But then she does proceed to answer the question.
One theme that's come up time and again with guests is what I would call like signposts on the road. Often you sort of perceive these in retrospect. Looking back down the road, that there are these signposts, these forks in the road, you could call them, where signal things happened and significant decisions were made. That's the magic in a story somehow. You can't often see it whilst it's happening, although you might have an intuitive realization that there's an important decision to be made, and sometimes we chicken out. And of course, in Genesis's life, these signposts just seem to be there right from the beginning, right? So shall we walk through his life and just digress whenever it feels right into, your meetings with him?
Yeah. Jen was born in Manchester and grew up in Hull, in that area, with very serious asthma. When you grow up with asthma or with a debilitating illness where you can't, be as athletic or be as social, you end up going more into yourself. For the lucky ones like Jen and even myself, you find books, right? And you find culture and literature. And Jen found some pretty incredible books like the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And, very young, very early got into Buddhism.
That point's very significant to me, because when you're talking to him, he says that he was off school a lot because he was ill so much. At 11, discovers the Tibetan Book of the Dead, tries to meditate. He has this, I guess it's some sort of attack to do with his illness. He's taken to hospital and he's sort of declared medically dead. But most strangely, hears the medics saying that he's dead and discussing which one of them is going to tell his parents. And he's saying, "I'm not dead," having this out-of-body experience. And
Suddenly I couldn't breathe. I fell off the bed. My sister heard this thud and came upstairs and found me. And we got to the hospital and we were medically dead. My only memory of that part is floating above my body in the ER with these doctors and nurses crowded round. And they're saying, "Who's going to tell the parents, that he's dead?" And they're all going, I don't want to tell them. And they're like, "Well, somebody's got to tell them. I'm thinking, I'm not dead. I'm here, up here, hey, you know. And then I don't remember going back in my own body, but I came back. The doctor said, well, you're going to have to take these pills for the rest of your life. And you could live a normal life, or you could drop dead any day. We just don't know. And we'd already thought through that we didn't trust our inherited society. We didn't trust the agreement about morals and purpose and self-governance of one's own fate. We didn't believe what the world outside was telling us. We didn't want to just accept everything that we were told was supposed to happen in our life. If I decide, as I really want to just be an artist, a creator in some way, the worst that could happen then is I just drop dead. That's not so bad. So fuck it.
At the age of 11.
That was one of a few of those magical quantum leap changing moments where, Jen realized that, one, the fragility of life, but also the power of what you can do with your life. And it also coincided that it was in the 60s when, the Summer of Love was happening and a lot of, socialist and commune ideologies. It was a perfect storm that was happening. And, very early on, probably at the age of 18, 19, Jen already jumped into this existence with the Exploding Galaxy, which was a performance art-based commune.
But even before that, he's reading Crowley, he's reading William Burroughs. I mean, and you've got somebody, who for medical reasons and also for, I suppose you could sort of say for their own inner reasons, is quite different. He talked about being bullied, right, as well at school. A classic thing. So you're othered right from the beginning.
Yeah.
Finding your education, as you say, in reading the beats, reading Burroughs. And so you kind of, in a way, become an autodidact. You self-teach through countercultural mentors, especially at that time, as you say, in the late 60s and stuff.
And it's interesting how much that literature informed so many people that went on doing really incredible things. It's a really strong foundation.
I think that he was already taking a leaf out of that book as well, because even at school, and certainly when he was at Hull Uni, he was instrumental in putting together strange magazines, right? And they had a magazine called Worm where they just published everything that anybody put in the magazine's pigeonhole, including the instructions to how to build a Molotov cocktail. So, of course, it got banned by the Students' Union, fair enough, you could say. And that itself seemed to set the tone for what was to come, did it not? A lifetime of publishing stuff and getting, censored, threatened with prosecution and banned,
You can see, early on, Jen found shock value and extremism as a form of communication and a way to get people's attention to Trojan horse more meaningful messages. But over time, you see that tactic. There's a really straight thread in terms of themes and ways of doing things that you see just get refined over time and improve and evolve. But you can trace it back, all the way to childhood.
And if we could just loop back to 69, because you mentioned it there, he leaves university early, comes to London, and gets involved with David Medalla and the Exploding Galaxy.
Well, I started out in a street theatre group, a free-flowing, anarchic, poets, artists, dancers, painters, sculptors, musicians, all riding on the crest of the psychedelic wave in London called the Exploding Galaxy.
And I stayed for a few months. And they had a really rigorous system. It was all about letting go of attachment. And I had a violin, a sleeping bag, and a diary. And that was it. I wasn't allowed to have money. Any money went in a box, and that was shared. Any clothes you had went in another box. So every morning, whoever got up first got the choice of what was in the box. Whoever was late getting out of bed got what was left. They knocked out the wall of the toilet and the bathroom, so you had no privacy. And you were not allowed to sleep in the same place 2 nights running. So I slept in the hallway near the front door, on the roof, and it was brilliant.
We looked one day at the Bible, and we looked at Genesis, and it's the book of creation. And we thought, that's the point. Everything is creation.
And of course, I changed my name from my given name, which was Neil Megson, to Genesis P-Orridge. And that wasn't because I wanted a funny name, it was because I wanted to control the narrative of my own life.
And it was this, anarchic, free-flowing commune performance art group. They were kind of one of the first, and the pioneers. The work they did reflected in how they lived as well. They really tried their best to defy every societal convention that we were living in. And obviously there's a lot of ideology and naivety and hope around that.
Possibly naive, but at the same time wonderfully optimistic, radical thing to experiment in living, right? But he says that he just had a violin, a sleeping bag, and a diary. It has to be said about Genesis at this time and through much of his life, he was stunningly beautiful, wasn't he? He was actually a beautiful looking person, terrifying later on somewhat, but at this time in particular, in his kind of more hippie phase. Gorgeous, right? He looked like a psychedelic prince in some ways, whatever he was wearing.
Yeah, I think that's a thing you see a lot in people who are frontmen, right? The physical beauty, but that charisma and that very articulate, very smart, but also very persuasive. He had it was the inklings or the beginning traits of some people who become either frontmen of big bands or cult leaders or, presidents or politicians, right? And Jen kind of became all of them, but none of them at the same time.
This super influential thing happened, which is that he saw somewhere William Burroughs had written to something and actually put his address in the letter that he did. And he writes to Burroughs and Burroughs replies and they meet. And that seemed to also be an incredibly significant thing in his development.
If you were to trace like the big moments, I think that was probably the second biggest moment in Jen's transformative experience where, right, like it's not enough to just read the books and to, learn. And Jen reaches out to William and writes William this really funny and scathing letter, which obviously caught William's attention. Like if Jen had grown up in the 80s and probably would have been in advertising because she's so good at getting people's attention. And William wrote back and they met up. And in that first meeting, William saw in Jen next of kin.
He's with Burroughs in Burroughs' Duke Street flat. And Burroughs, of course, lived in London for a long time as the kind of l'ombre invisible, invisible man. And whilst they're talking, Genesis says it's the first time we'd ever seen a TV which had a remote control. And Burroughs, whilst they're talking, is continually changing the channels. And it's like a demonstration of the cut-up technique, that the channels are shifting the whole time. And talking about the whole Brian Geison's cut-up technique. And of course, it seems like Genesis had some sort of epiphany that the world was like that. The world was actually kind of continually sort of being cut up. This is a sidebar about the cut-up technique. In the 1950s, the artist and writer Brian Geison accidentally stumbled upon a revolutionary technique that would go on to influence generations of avant-garde artists and authors. Known as the cut-up method, it involved taking a text and physically cutting them into pieces, then rearranging the fragments to create new, unexpected meanings. Brian first discovered the potential of the cut-up while staying at the Beat Hotel in Paris in 1959. As he was trimming magazine articles with a razor blade, he noticed the results when he began rearranging the sliced up words and sentences. He saw the cut-up as a way to liberate language from the static, linear confines of traditional narratives. His collaborator and close friend William Burroughs was quick to recognise the power of the cut-up. Burroughs, who was already experimenting with all sorts of techniques in his own writing, became an ardent proponent. He and Geison explored its potential to reveal hidden connections and unleash the subconscious into the written word. They believed that the cut-up could act as a kind of literary virus, infecting and disrupting the linear flow of language. Geison's own cut-up experiments ranged from poetry to audio collages to visual art. He was fascinated by the idea that the subconscious mind could be accessed and channeled through the disruption of linear thinking. The Cut-Up's influence can be traced through the work of countless artists and writers, from the 60s through David Bowie and Brian Eno to contemporary practitioners. Geisen and Burroughs outline the key principles. Take a page of text, whether your own writing or an external source. Cut the page into 4 sections, rearrange the sections in a new order, read the resulting text, and allow your mind to make unexpected associations. As he leaves, Burroughs says to him, Genesis, your job is to short-circuit control, right? And that phrase seems to kind of echo through the years for him, doesn't it? From then onwards. He refers to it many times in the film, doesn't he?
Jen spent a lot of their life caught in between what that meant, right? Is it short-circuiting control of society? Is it short-circuiting control of identity? Is it short-circuiting control of yourself? Sometimes I think Jen took it too literally and it ended up exploding certain things in their life. But I think over time, what short-circuiting control truly meant is helping people see things from a different lens. As storytellers and as artists and as filmmakers, that's the most profound thing you can do. That's the magic, is helping someone get outside of their own heads and see life from a different angle. And I think when Jen was in that room seeing William manically click through a TV, I think it clicked in Jen's mind that, oh wow, this is a way to tell stories, or a way to make art that I identify with. And in some way, it's the truest form of storytelling, because the way we process information is actually not in a linear sense. It's a structure and it's a system that we found through books and through literature and music and, with verses and phrases and whatnot. It helps us grasp things, but it doesn't really help us see reality. And I think the cut-up theory really helps you see reality for what it is. The cut-up theory became pervasive in all of Jen's body of work, and including cutting up Jen's own body at the end of their life through the Pandrogyne project, which we'll get into a little bit later. Profound experience.
The next thing we can talk about is his meeting with Christine Carroll Newby, Cozy Fanny Tutti as she became known, and the sort of founding of COUM, and COUM's cosmic organicism of the universe molecular transmissions, right?
Right. It's the idea that we transcend our own being, of the lines between our consciousness and our subconsciousness.
Cozy is the first of this kind of triple goddess type relationships that he had throughout his life. 3 big relationships. Tell us about that meeting and tell us about what happened.
Jen was really a romantic at heart. I think that oftentimes didn't know how to express that romanticism, or maybe it blurred into the art. And that can be beautiful, but it can also be dangerous at times. But it really stems from Jen's parents. And I think that gave Jen an idealized version of what it meant to be together. And obviously, when you're growing up, oftentimes you only see the good side, right? You don't see the struggles and hard work that it takes to be able to be together. And you think that things can be that way. So I think when Jen met Cozy, he just fell, madly in love, and when realized how badass and creative and a true artist Cozy was, all of those worlds kind of collided and clashed together, and then they created COUM and, really amazing transgressive performance art. I think that transgressiveness probably bled into their personal lives. Cozy, of whom I'm a huge fan, I love their work and especially the music that Chris and Cozy make. But, she didn't want to be involved in this project, which I completely respect. She was very graceful about it. I can't really speak much to what happened in their personal lives, how I believe the lines got blurred, and when those lines get blurred, things can get messy and the collision can turn into a car crash of sorts.
Obviously, things ended badly between them. Cozy's since written a memoir, which she talked about Jen in extremely difficult times. But for anybody who doesn't know their story, they were doing these very confrontational performances. It's 75, 76, which of course is the same time as, punk was erupting into the British consciousness. Shows which were, really pushing sexual taboos, transgressive art, occultism, serial killers, right? The first incarnation really of when a male and female character will become interchangeable, right? almost acting as one hermaphroditic being. There is, of course, this famous show at the ICA in 1976, the Institute of Contemporary Arts. And the strange thing about the ICA is it's on the Mall, so it's about half a mile up from Buckingham Palace, right? It's right at the heart of the British establishment. I don't know how they got this show at all, but it was called Prostitution. It was a kind of retrospective, right? There were used tampons, there was pornography, there was all sorts of stuff. As you can imagine, in this country, the media went absolutely ballistic. This is when they were called wreckers of civilization, right?
Yeah, and the irony is that, once you become a tabloid character, you become part of popular culture, right? Like if none of that had happened, that ICA show would have went on and Jen would have never become this larger than life character, or,
right.
or Throbbing Gristle may have not, which was the band they created right after that performance, right, would have never blown up. The oppressors end up shining a spotlight on the oppressed without them even knowing that.
In the, what is it now, 50 years, I guess, since right then, we've seen a lot of performance art, we've seen a lot of sort of transgressive stuff. In a sense, we've got somewhat used to that, right? But at the time, certainly in this country, there was nothing like that. It had moved out of the hippie stuff that was going on, that was people just found strange and sort of alien, into something which was threatening, right? I mean, that was the issue, wasn't it? It felt like a threat right at the heart of the British artistic establishment. I don't know who put that show on, but I'm sure they got sacked.
I mean, they tried to sack the show before it started, but they went on with it anyways, but they got shut down after the first night. There was a lot of sex magic-like performances, and it was pretty out there, even for today, honestly. I don't think the world's caught up to the work yet. No, but even beyond the establishment being against it, there's a great newspaper cutout. They did a performance at the ICA in Los Angeles. Chris Burden left the show in the middle in disgust. They said it was the most horrifying thing they've ever seen. It's vulgar, it's disgusting, and it's not art. I just love the idea of Chris Burden, who's, quote unquote, one of the most transgressive artists of our time, not being able to stomach a COUM performance. For me, that's almost more telling than the Queen shutting down a show.
But they shut down themselves effectively, because, as rather than sort of carrying on with COUM, is that what did they do? They close it down and start Throbbing Gristle. So tell us about that and how that began.
Jen realized after COUM, had that big moment, Jen realized that it didn't matter what they would do in the art world, they would still only be speaking to the art crowd. Jen wanted to cut through and go further and realize that music, especially at the time, it's a little bit later, but Beatles and Rolling Stones and then the punk movement, like music was everything for a teenager's life during that time.
You're right, because the ICA, however enlightened, however experimental the curators were that brought COUM to the ICA was still a kind of rather refined...
It's a bubble.
Yeah, it's a bubble of the kind of the trendy end of the art establishment, right? Whereas rock and roll and punk were speaking directly to the energy of young people.
And to the working class, because that's where Jen came from. That was how industrial music was really created, right? So Throbbing Gristle was with, maybe the addition of Chris and a couple other people that came on to form Throbbing Gristle. They were like, how can we go beyond the transgressiveness of punk, right? How can we challenge the system, but also pay tribute to the oppressed, the people that are suffering from that system? And those are the factory workers. And I think that was really the inspiration to this industrial sound and the industrial look. And Jen used the term cultural engineer, but was very prescriptive on how they dressed and what their logo, all of those elements were important, and to make a dent and for the messages to be heard. Right? Like if it wasn't for Malcolm McLaren and Vivienne Westwood, we would never have known who were the Sex Pistols. That combination of image and sound and message is instrumental to being heard.
And also to take that punk ethos of, let's prove that you can have a successful, radical, innovative band with people who can't play.
Yeah, exactly. Like at least Sid Vicious knew 3 chords, like they knew no chords.
And that's when we decided to change to Throbbing Gristle. And we proved that nobody needed to have any training to make successful, radical new art. Let's prove that you can also have a successful, radical, innovative band with people who can't play.
Testing, hello. Oh, listen.
My personal interest was very much to rebuild a magical approach to sound.
It's about short-circuiting control. Our basic approach became that you can't make mistakes. You can only make things that either appeal or don't appeal to certain people.
It's very interesting you said that something in the sound of industry, the industrial, would connect with people who worked in working class places like factories.
Yeah. The punk movement, in the beginning, it was true to the working class, but I think it quickly just co-opted the working class and almost stole their look and turned it into fashion.
Right.
And I think the industrial movement did the opposite, right? It tried to get to the heart and the feelings and the emotion and the sounds and the just the drabness, right, of that existence.
And they made terrifyingly loud sounds, didn't they? Described as too shocking for punk.
Yeah, exactly. None of them expected it to take on the world. Till this day, you see kids that are like, late teens or into their mid 20s that are equally just as big of fans.
So they kickstarted or they inspired a whole generation, a whole genre, right, of other artists, some of whom have gone obviously on to be extremely successful. But they didn't stay together for that long, did they? And I get the impression that it was tied up with maybe the end of Jen and Cozy's relationship. She got together with Chris. Does it fall apart, or does she pull it down? What happens?
Throbbing Gristle didn't last a very long time, but if you combine it with COUM, right, it's for the life of a typical ensemble, right, for lack of better words, it's quite and for the extremism and the way they did things, it's quite a long time. It just fell apart. It's egos get involved. This push for transcendental creativity comes and it all collides together. And then when some success comes in, it's just a recipe for a disaster. Other than the personal differences, I think that Chris and Cozy found their groove and found a beautiful way of making music. And I feel like they wanted to evolve in that direction. And for Jen, it was always about the message and about doing something different and defying the norm. And you see that in when Jen goes into Psychic TV. Two boats going in different directions and both creating different but beautiful expressions of art.
And I think around about this time, he actually meets Brian Guyton, right? I think Burroughs finally kind of introduces them.
Yeah.
And meeting Guyton, who's somewhat of a mentor, right? And had actually, developed the cut-up technique in the first place. So again, that circled back, didn't it? And he starts to cut things up again.
A lot of the ideas that William Burroughs and Ginsberg and others carried through really came from Brian's genius in his artwork. One can say that Jen never had a medium because they went from performance to music to films to art to photography to body modification. But truly, it's all based on the cut-up theory. And Psychic TV was really audio-visual performance group.
How much was his meeting with Paula, who's, in a way is the second of this sort of triple goddess relationships that he has? I mean, how influential was that, do you think, in the genesis of Psychic TV?
The beginning, Paula was a muse. Inspired Jen to push forward and, had a lot of courage and bravery. After Psychic TV was formed, Paula played a really important role in the band of doing the cassette tape remixes and cut-ups and bringing a deeper sense of exploration and experimentation to the band.
And this, of course, was the video generation, wasn't it? So this isn't a band anymore. We've got to combine the music with visuals, right?
Jen discovering and befriending and becoming so close with Derek Jarman was a huge influence. Derek Jarman, in some ways, was kind of the fifth Beatle to Psychic TV and provided a lot of the visuals that went on to making the band as memorable and as important as it is. Not just that, but again, understanding that the performance piece spoke to a bubble, we did music in a certain way, but that music also only reached a more niche or a specific crowd. How can I make something that's alternative and underground, but also have a pop sensibility? And then you see that in the music, right? So the visuals and the conceptual part are very experimental and avant-garde. But if you listen to the music, it's very simple and poppy, and there are a bunch of love songs if you really look at them.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because I was listening to Godstar, right, and I thought, God, this is like a Syd Barrett song.
Yeah.
It sounds like one of those early Floyd songs, like a really kind of poppy, psychedelic poppy, right?
This is a story, a very special story. It's about Brian Jones, one of the Rolling Stones. Where were you when the stars went out? Where were you when they started to shout? I saw you alone by the pool, and all your friends told you a fool. And you were so beautiful, and you were so very special. I wish I was with you now. I wish I could save you somehow. And where were all your friends that night? As you switched off the final light, I saw your body in the water, like a lamb going to the slaughter.
And at this time as well, it's almost like the hippie thing that he'd been involved in more in the late 60s and 70s kind of like circles back in, doesn't it? In the way he looks, the magic's definitely back. Also, this is the nearest he gets, I suppose, to becoming a cult, isn't it? Because it isn't Psychic TV, isn't just a band, it isn't just a mixed media project. They found this thing, the Temple of Psychic Youth.
Psychic TV started in the early 80s, and there was a lot of fan clubs for bands around that time where you would use mail as a device to communicate with your fans and go back and forth and sell products. And especially in the independent alternative scene, even, when I was, I grew up in the music scene in Brazil in the 90s, we would, correspond with, bands all over the world, and it was still the norm. Jen was like, why start a normal fan club when you can, kind of create a mock cult? So the Temple of Psychic Youth was almost a parody or a critique on cult culture that was happening during the time. It was really booming. When the hippie communes got dark, they turned into cults. It was late 70s, early 80s. So the Temple of Psychic Youth originally was to turn the fan club into a cult itself. It was really giving these important messages of short-circuiting control, of waking up. There was a zine that was all about how to exercise and take good care of your body. If your physical self isn't in good shape, your mental health wouldn't be. Like, what band does that, especially in the early 80s, right?
Yeah, they were publishing things. It wasn't just about flogging more merch to your fans, right?
It wasn't about the band at all. It was about how to be a better human being, like most of the stuff. There's this great book, the Psychic Bible, which is kind of a compilation of all of those zines. It reads like a self-help book.
The press also start to get all over Jen, again, right? This person, they use this headline, a demigod who feeds pop fans on sex, sadism, and devil worship. What a headline, right? He's dressing as a priest. That's not going to help, is it? Let's face it. This vile man corrupts kids. He, meanwhile, is issuing statements like, who can I inspire, inform, who can I encourage, right? And saying that he wants to create staggering pleasure in the world. But of course, there are activities which do start to get pretty transgressive, right? In Brighton, he does start to draw some bad media flack, right?
Right. And Jen also made a lot of funny artwork that portrayed the Queen, that it deeply upset her. And it was during the time that satanic panic was, becoming a thing in England, and Margaret Thatcher was, witch hunting, was using the concept of Satanism to banish free thinkers and anyone who was trying to challenge that conservative viewpoint of society. As you said, it didn't help that Jen would dress as a priest, and then in the houses they had these rooms where they could just be free for any form of pleasure experimentation, not just sexual. How I've never experienced it, obviously. The little that I know about them, they were kind of these safe spaces for people to experiment with whatever they wanted through touch and through their bodies. And they would film it. A lot of times there was body modification or ritual cutting. You can easily misconstrue that as, a satanic ritual.
This satanic panic thing, it was a big thing. It was all over the media. I don't know about in the States, but certainly in the UK, that there was literally a subversive subculture of Satanists who were bent on abusing children and doing all sorts of other things to bring down society. But it was a genuine panic, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's very common for people to control through fear. Who are we afraid of more than the devil, right? Like, or in the case in America, we're terrified of socialists and communists, and that's why when you have someone as amazing as Bernie Sanders, who actually just wants to help the country and help the people, the media and the opposition brand them as a socialist or a communist, quickly and easily discount their credibility. So I just think it's a cheap shot. We live in a headline culture. Of the people that read the headline, this vile man corrupts kids, how many people did actually read the literature that he was, or the messages that he was trying to share, or the fact that he was an incredible father at the time of 2 kids? Nobody cared to learn more. It's no different now, too.
With Paula, he's now become a dad. He's got 2 baby daughters, right?
Yeah.
And as is very evident in your movie, which you've already mentioned, actually, they were this very happy family and to some extent living an ordinary domestic family life, right? Kids were included in tours and stuff like that, but they had a very happy childhood from what you can see, right?
Yeah, I mean, the daughters, they're just the loveliest, most well-adjusted people, and just talking to them now is very telling of the past. Jen was many people, and probably the most natural version of Jen, I would presume, was being this domestic person, someone who cared about their home and cared about building a family. And then again, with Paula, they took their daughters everywhere and they gave them a life experience that, is unmatched.
One of the places that they took them was to India, to Nepal, helping in soup kitchens in Kathmandu. They met Buddhist Rinpoches. And this is the moment when, back in Britain, because of all the stuff that's been going on in the media and this satanic ritual abuse hysteria, this is the time when they get accused of sexually abusing children, possibly their own children, right? Now, we have to say immediately that there was a Channel 4 documentary and a police investigation, and he was completely cleared, and Channel 4 retracted the allegations. But as a consequence of that, what happens? They decide not to come back, right?
Jen was in Nepal with his family, and that's when they caught wind of what was going on. The Scotland Yard went into their home without them there and seized, I think it's like 4 tons of work. Like all the interviews Jen did with William Burroughs, there's like hundreds of hours were all burned by the Scotland Yard. Most importantly, neither Jen or Paula did not want to lose the custody of their kids. So they decided to move. One of the spiritual leaders in Nepal said, you should move to Northern California. And the person that Jen knew there was this psychedelic book dealer Michael Horowitz, who happened to be Winona Ryder's father. And at the time, and also best friends with Timothy Leary, who is Winona Ryder's godfather. So all of a sudden, they seek asylum to America, and they move, and they end up staying in Winona Ryder's childhood bedroom because she was off doing her movies and being a movie star at the time. This is in the early, like 91, in the early 90s. And Timothy Leary just really helped expand Jen's work and mind even further. And Jen was already in England, working on Acid House Records, and you know, got into the rave scene once they moved to Northern California, and became a huge instigator of the rave scene.
Yeah, Leary's quite old by this time, right? And he'd, of course, been in exile himself, hadn't he? He had to flee himself and hide out in Northern Africa, right? When he was being hunted by the American government. He really helped them, didn't he? He took the kids to Disneyland.
He was a great uncle to the daughters, throw birthday parties for them. Imagine Timothy Leary throwing a 7th birthday party for you at his house, like, right? Like the Beastie Boys would come around, and Sean Lennon and Jane's Addiction. Like, Jen had a recording studio in their home where we filmed. You know, it's in the film. We went back to their childhood home. And they were showing the room where we filmed the daughters was actually the recording studio. And they told us some stories that are not in the film of how the Beastie Boys went there and used to record with Jen, and Jane's Addiction and Sean Lennon.
They seem to be living also this kind of rather idyllic sort of Californian lifestyle as well. The house itself is pretty cool, isn't it? When he's talking to you, it also comes across said that he regarded himself or herself as many people, and they could be very kind.
Yeah.
Quite vulnerable, gentle, as well as the confrontational stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's someone who's studied but also experienced many different forms of spiritual practices, you know, from Santeria to Buddhism to, you know, starting their own cult. So there's already an openness. Jen was always very kind to me, well aware that, you know, as everyone, you have different phases of your life. And, you know, the hope is that as you get older, you learn and you become softer and kinder, right? That's kind of the hope for everyone. Instead of the cliche that as we get old, we get grumpier and more bitter. Right? The very first day, on our first interview, I went to pick up Jen at her house, and we were gonna go. We got a cab from her home in the Lower East Side to Brooklyn to get her portrait painted, which is kind of the thread of the film. And while we were in the cab, Caress, Jen's oldest daughter, called. And then I saw Jen turn into Dad just like that, and was a completely different person. And, you know, was grilling his daughter on her taxes, was being a really good dad, you know, like tough love, but in a really sweet way, talking to his grandkids. Jen would prefer to go as she, you know, towards the end of her life, but when Jen kicked into dad mode, he was definitely for me, is the biggest surprise in the film is his relationship with his daughters.
Without any doubt. I mean, it was very touching, and also to the extent that I knew about his life at all, it was the most surprising stuff. The home movie footage, either when they're little or as they're growing up, you know, and then actually the interview with both of them when they're both back at the house where they lived, when they're talking about times there.
I think my dad felt very strongly. I think my dad had a really immense capability for feeling emotions and empathy and like compassion.
But our dad was kind of like our rock, the person that I could talk to about anything.
Whenever you're ready.
We always had unconditional love.
He had a very good relationship with his own parents, didn't he? He wasn't like he was from a kind of, you know, troubled home, and they were very supportive of him. But sadly, he and Paula end up splitting too, right? This is the sort of the end of this second big relationship.
As most relationships, there's a beginning, middle, and end, and they were nearing their end, and it was very difficult at the time. And I think one way that Jen found of finding solace or escaping was going to New York, and Jen's friend, a BDSM dungeon, but that's where Jen actually crashed. Jen's friend let Jen use one of the rooms as a bedroom, and that's when Jen met Lady Jaye, who was a dominatrix at the time working at that dungeon.
And a nurse.
And a nurse,
as well,
nurse by day, dominatrix by night.
you know, it's the third big relationship for Jen, but also it sort of initiates, in a way, what happened right the way till the end in some ways, right? Because Lady Jaye, Jacqueline Breyer, it's an extraordinary relationship.
You know, other than her being this beautiful, charismatic, energetic beam of light, I think Jackie was truly free. But Jen still had that British upbringing, still had certain things that are hard to break from. And I think that Jackie really helped Jen cross over to that other side. You know, it started with them just playing around and cross-dressing and then getting matching haircuts. And then there was another death moment. Jen was jamming with Love and Rockets at Rick Rubin's studio in LA, and the house, which was Houdini's original house, literally short-circuited and caught on fire. And Jen jumped out of the window and fell in a really awkward way and punctured their lung, which caused Jen to die for a few minutes. And then Jen was brought back to life in the hospital. That was another life-changing moment.
My personal belief is that you can do anything you want to yourself. Body is your property. It's not sacred. It's not owned by society. It's not owned by family. It's not owned by laws and regulations. It's yours to do with as you choose and to explore as you choose. And for me, that's enough. There's enough there to keep you occupied for a very long time. But the idea of then extending that out, even voluntarily to other people, it becomes problematic.
This next thing, the Pandrogyne project, in some ways felt like it brought everything that he'd done so far together.
100%. He had this body of work, and then his body became the
work,
and obviously the cut-up process. Finally finding who he truly was through Lady Jaye.
So for listeners who don't know what the Pandrogyne project was, just tell us.
Yeah, so the Pandrogyne project was an art/life project where Genesis, P-Orridge, and Jackie and Lady Jaye did plastic surgery with the goal of becoming one. It's not about transitioning to becoming a woman or transitioning to becoming a man. It's about transitioning to becoming one being. Their theory was that having a kid is a way to do that, right? When you and someone else combine your DNA and it becomes a child, that child is the combination of the two of you. They wanted to create a new way of doing that, which was combining their look conceptually, not physically, to becoming one. The documentation of that project became an art exhibit and a gigantic body of work in itself, and it's currently in the permanent collection of the Tate Modern and at MoCA, and I believe at MoMA as well. So Marie Lozier made a beautiful film called The Ballad of Genesis and Lady Jaye, where she artfully documents that process while they're doing it.
As the project progressed, it really became the kind of the frame in which they were producing the work from now on, and in communicating with people who were interested in what they did. And I guess until 2007 when Lady Jaye died, right?
They became their art, you know, that was kind of the climax of Jen's exploration of identity and sense of self, fully realizing the cosmosis.
And this third relationship with Lady Jaye, the culmination of that cosmosis, but she dies in 2007, quite young actually.
Lady Jaye was, I think, 15 or 17 years younger. They never imagined it to happen that way. It was always more about how Lady Jaye would carry on with their identity in their lives. Yeah, Lady Jaye unfortunately had stomach cancer and died from complications of it.
He lives on for 13 years. He continued to have this kind of relationship. He says that, you know, Genesis was in the material world, Lady Jaye was in the immaterial world, you know, that they were still in some ways communicating, working together, being together. What was Genesis's life in those 13 years like?
Jen was living in New York the whole time. Yeah, moved to an apartment in the Lower East Side and dealt with a lot of grief, found comfort in that idea that they were one Lady Jaye became Jen's subconscious in a way, and Jen was the consciousness, and they kind of blurred their lines together. At the same time, I think reemergence of psychic TV really helped, gave Jen a lifeline. Jen went, found this African twin ritual in the Yoruba tribes. Through channeling spirits and through ritualistic practices, you're able to bring the essence of the spirit of that loved being into an object, which was a little doll that looked like Lady Jaye, and Jen always carried it around with them.
You have to keep going, you have to. And that's the only way. I think the word separation it works better to describe what we would call death, because it's much more expansive. Tarmac road is a form of death to the earth beneath it. And that's the separation between the earth and the sky and the sun, and doesn't allow things to grow, etc. So there's lots of different forms of death happening as a result of the separation.
After the grieving period, duplicated their efforts and their output of just making more and more art, publishing books, writing their memoir, and touring. We were going to film Psychic TV's last show. They were going to perform in Moscow in 2019, which was going to be an underground show because it's prohibited for trans people to perform there. And Jen just got too sick.
They carried on having surgical operations and carried on altering their body, right, as well. That continued too.
Yeah. And making this film, right? Like that was one of the final pieces that Jen did.
So, David, we've come to the end of their life. The film is beginning its life. In some ways, it's been out for a little while. You spent that time with Genesis at the end, and maybe you could just talk about the last time you were together?
The last interview was about 2 weeks before she passed. Jen was in great spirits. I would ask her if she needed me to pick up something on the way to her house. And she always asked me to get cranberry grape ocean spray, which is the worst juice you can think of in your life. But that was her drink of choice, and she would mix it with some vodka. And I hated vodka, but I would drink it with her as we conducted these interviews. And I would always bring a fresh batch of yellow flowers because our chats would usually go on for 2 hours. This one, around an hour. She just couldn't do it anymore.
All of us, in the end, are consciousness, primarily. There's a brief moment of an apparently physical existence. And the rest of the time, there's something else, or nothing, or both.
I said, I have a very corny final question. Which was, what was the most meaningful lesson you learned in your life? Quickly, Jen said, it's something Lady Jaye taught me, that we have this secret power. We have this human ability that every day we can wake up and be someone else. You don't have to be the same person. And embracing your many selves is really the true power. You're only true to yourself if you can be and embrace your many selves.
David Charles Rodriguez, thanks so much for coming to the Bureau of Lost Culture.
Thank you. Great, man. Talking to you.
Thanks so much to David. If that piqued your interest, I do really recommend that you check out his film, She Is Still Here, the official Genesis P-Orridge documentary. It's pretty amazing. It's very moving. And you probably could tell from some of those clips there, Genesis is a great interviewee and always was. I'm not really a fan of industrial music myself, and I suspect I would have been quite alarmed by Genesis if I'd met him, particularly in the early days. He could be very confrontational, and in Cozy Funny Tootie's recent memoir, that's apparent. His darkness was obviously there too. He was a deeply controversial and I think a deeply countercultural figure, as we said. And by the end, I think it's apparent from David's film, a very humane figure and an extraordinarily committed artist. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you enjoy all our stories. You can check them all out at bureauoflostculture.com. Thanks to everybody who's written in recently. I've been very hectic with our festival over the last 6 weeks, but I will be replying in due course. And hope to see you, my countercultural friends, or hear you, or meet you further down the road, round the bend, and over the hillsides for more of these tales from the underground, from the other side. Let's finish with some music.